Hello, and welcome to this introductory video for the Islamic Art module on the Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art here at SOAS. My name is Malcolm McNeil, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being director of this overall program. And today I'd like to welcome you here to join us for this pre-recorded session, where the two conveners of our Islamic Art module and a long-standing supporter and former convener of the module will present for us three condensed, engaging examples of the kinds of objects that you will study if you join us at SOAS for this course in April 2022. Our first speaker is Chiara de Nicolais, who has recently moved back to SOAS after a hiatus of more than a decade working across the leading auction houses of the commercial world. She's, in fact, we're privileged and proud to say she is a former alumni of the postgraduate diploma who went on to complete her MA here before working across a panoply of objects and materials at both Christie's and for a more extended period at Sotheby's here in London. So thank you, Chiara, for joining us today. Our second speaker is Dr. Melanie Gibson, who will be known to many, if not all of you, who are part of our postgraduate diploma in Asian art community. She has been a long-standing supporter of this program in its many iterations, and a formative influence in shaping the both the recent and indeed the current form of the Islamic art module we have here, working both as a lecturer and a consultant, in addition to her full-time role as the editor at Ginkgo Library. So Melanie, thank you very much for joining us today. And our third speaker that we'll be hearing from today is Dr. Natasha Morris, who has recently added work at SOAS to her wider portfolio of teaching experience. She also teaches at the Courtauld, from where she holds a doctorate focusing on art of the Persian world, particularly masculinities in the Qajar period, if I'm not mistaken. And in addition to her academic and university experience, Dr. Morris was the recent project curator for the exhibition that I hope many of you had the chance to see, Reflections, Contemporary Art of the Middle East and North Africa at the British Museum. So thank you all very much for joining us, and particular thanks to all of our speakers today for giving us this engaging, focused and object-centered introduction to the Islamic art program that we'll be teaching here on the postgrad diploma in Asian art at SOAS. If you want to find out anything more about what's included in this program, don't hesitate to get in touch with us at asianart@soas.ac.uk or email me directly as director. My email is mm133@soas.ac.uk, and I would be delighted to meet with you one-to-one to tell you more about this particular module and the broader program we offer here. And I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Chiara de Nicolais.
Thank you, Malcolm. My name is Chiara, and I'm one of the two conveners of the module. I'm delighted to kick off this event and present to you a leaf from a Qur'an written in Kufic. The leaf is dated to the 9th to the early 10th century, and it was copied in the Middle East. And it is now in the Nasser David Khalili collection in London. With the term Kufic, we identify a style of written Arabic which is characterized by angular and rectilinear letter forms. It was the most common style of script used between the 8th and the 12th century, all across the Islamic lands. And you will encounter it not only on manuscripts, but also monuments, coins, and objects. In order to understand Kufic, we need to briefly look at what script was used before. Soon after the revelation of the Qur'an, the text started to be written down. The earliest copies are written in a style called Ijazi, which developed in the Arabian Peninsula. And as you can see from these images, it looks like a very dry cursive style. The image on the left is from a section now at the British Library, while the image on the right is from a Qur'an which was recently discovered in Birmingham's University Library. What strikes the most is that the pages have a vertical format, which is more familiar and in line with the Western tradition. They were modestly decorated, and if any of you is familiar with the Arabic language, you might notice that there are very few diacritic marks on the letters. Diacritics are marks placed above or below a letter in a word to indicate a particular pronunciation. In Arabic, the lack of a diacritic might lead to mispronunciation of a word and hence a misunderstanding of its meaning. All of these leaves are dated to the late 7th, beginning of the 8th century. So by the end of the 7th century, with growing Umayyads' influence and power in the region, a wish to regulate the script and also make Arabic the language of the empire developed. You might be familiar with the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the mosaics which decorates the inside. If you remember, an inscription all around the base of the dome written in golden Kufic is visible. And if we compare the script of those mosaics to the one of our leaf, they're very, very similar. It is in this context that we need to look at our Kufic leaf today, a new style of writing which becomes common in the region, and it is largely used for different purposes. In our case, a copy of the Qur'an. So as you can see from this image, the text is written in a dark brown, nearly black ink. Compared to what we've seen before in the Hijazi leaves, the first thing which strikes us is that it's not anymore a vertical format, but an horizontal one. And the text is not anymore all squashed together, but sits balanced on 9 lines. Some letters have even been elongated just to fill in the space and balance the aesthetic of the text. And I've circled them in green. So would any of you dare to guess the material used? Do you think it's paper or do you think it's something else? It does look like paper. It's very white. And when you handle it, I can tell you that it feels very smooth and light in weight, similar to high quality paper. But it is not paper, it is actually parchment. Parchment is a writing material made of animal skin, which is scraped, stretched, and polished to become very smooth. The text is written in dark brown ink, but the second line is written in gold and has quite an elaborate palmette on the margin. As many of you know, the Quran is divided into 114 chapters, also called surahs. In Umayyad time, to make it easier for the reader, headings or chapter markers were introduced. So this lavish gold line is no other than a surah heading, and the palmette on the margin would have helped the reciter in going through the manuscript and find the surah he was looking for. So while looking at it, you might have spotted an irregular gold decoration, 3 dots which seem to appear randomly within the text. I have circled them in green. These are verse markers and again have been added to help the reader in the recitation. If you look even closer, there's also a gold pear-shaped mark at the end of the last line. This marker does not look like the others, and it is used to mark every 5th verse. The use of 5th or 10th verse markers became common as it helped the reader when he was after a particular verse in the surah, helping him to have an idea of the length of the chapter and finding the verse he was after. All of these reading tools were not present in earlier Hijazi leaves, as we've seen before, and became only common only in the 9th century and have been used ever since. So Quran manuscripts started to be widely copied all over the Islamic lands, and Kufic became the preferred style between the 8th and the 12th century. They differ in size and decoration, but have Kufic as a common element, as you can see from other 3 leaves which I've chosen as a comparable to ours. Due to the lack of evolution of the script, it has been difficult to identify regional characteristics or trends. If you notice, most of these leaves are usually catalogued as Near Eastern or North African. And unless there's a strong link with a particular mosque, it is very difficult to attribute them to a certain region. For sure, there is a wish to transmit the Quran and Kufic is seen as the most noble script to do so. Along with more standard copies, as the one which we have just seen, extravagant and luxurious manuscripts were also commissioned. The most spectacular examples were often written in gold. And here you can see details from 3 different Qur'ans copied in gold ink. I'll now pass the word to my colleague, Dr. Melanie Gibson, who will talk to you about a ceramic.
Hello, my name is Melanie Gibson, and for once I'm not the convener of this module. I've been the convener in the past for a very long time, but now I will be lecturing you on ceramics, and today I've chosen to speak about a really splendid lustre dish from Kashan. It's an enormous piece of ceramic in a ceramic bowl. It's about 47.5 centimeters in diameter. It's painted in cobalt on the exterior, and on the interior, it's glazed white, over which lustre, the whole scene that you see was painted in lustre. It belongs to the David collection in Copenhagen, but was actually made in Kashan somewhere in the last quarter of the 12th century. So you can see a scene of a classroom with a teacher in the center. Here he is, blown up for you. You can see a bearded man in a turban, and that suggests that he's a man of authority, probably of religious authority. He's wearing a very fine robe with what is known as a tiraz band on the sleeve, which is this element here that you see. He's sitting cross-legged. He's holding up a wooden tablet known as a lauch, and he's holding a cane in his right hand, presumably to beat any student who's not doing as he's told. And behind him is this X-framed piece of furniture, which is a rakhla, a Qur'an or book stand. The students he's teaching sit all around him. There are 24 of them. They're also wearing spotted robes, and they're all holding up their left hand with their right hand beside them. And they all seem to be facing in one direction, except for one student who I'm going to look at in a moment. They too hold writing tablets beside them, which seem to have repeated single letters or words. It's possible that this is a lesson in calligraphy, an art for which Kashan was famous. I was interested in seeing if I could find any examples of the objects in on the bowl still surviving today. And I did find that there are still, or at least in the 19th century, up until the 19th century, wooden writing boards were being used in madrasas and schools by the students, on which they would write the surahs from the Quran in order to memorize them, and then they'd be able to wash them off. And they'd be writing with these type of reed pens known as qalam. And the Quran stand that I showed you is an X-framed object such as this, which actually can be folded flat, but on the exterior has got carved decoration. This is an object which is slightly later than the one on the dish, but it's signed and dated by its maker. But it's obviously, this was a tradition that lasted for a long time. Now here we are back to the dish. Now I said that only two of the students are not facing in the same direction as the others. And they are these two students here. And as you can see, this individual here looks at the other student beside him. It's therefore been suggested that this is not a generic scene of a classroom, as might at first be supposed, but this is in fact a depiction of a specific moment in a narrative of the poem of Layla and Majnun, which was written by the poet Nizami in the 12th, actually more or less at the same time that this bowl was made. And it forms part of 5 narrative poems in an entire book called the Khamsa. So this is the first scene, and it's a scene of Case, a young boy, meeting and instantaneously falling in love with Layla. And it's slightly special even within, I'm just going to go back a second. If you see here, they actually have more writing boards, which almost create a frame around them. And also this cock-headed ewer, which is above them and which has some kind of symbolic significance, which I haven't yet been able to pin down. Now, Case goes to school. He's he's born late to someone who, to a family who he was very much wanted, and he's sent off to school. And at the very first meeting, he meets Layla and falls in love with her. But the fact is that they are not destined to be together. When rumors of their love start to get about, she is restricted to her tent, and eventually she's married off to a merchant. Case is so distracted with love and so miserable by this that he wanders off into the desert, where people look at him in his distracted state and call him Majnun, or mad, hence the title of the poem. Now, Majnun wanders off into the desert, he speaks to the animals, and eventually Layla actually dies of grief. And Case, Majnun, then throws himself on her tomb and dies too. It's a tragic ending. And not surprisingly, people who have read this poem, such as the English poet Byron, called it the Romeo and Juliet of the East. Now, the depiction on this bowl is the earliest that we know. It was much, much represented in the arts of the book, in paintings, particularly manuscripts of the 15th century. And here we've got this is a depiction of that very same scene, in which you can see Layla and Majnun in the corner. Here they are, here's the detail. They're just underneath the apex of the arch, and Case is sitting, looking at his book, studying the Qur'an, which is resting on a rakhla, and Layla is beside him, and they're once again looking deep into each other's eyes. And what's extraordinary is that this story is being depicted on this ceramic bowl at such an early stage. Just one thing to say is that the context of the madrasa, of the building that is shown in the painting, is not shown on the bowl. And from the painting, you can actually tell that we're sitting in an iwan, that is this recessed arch, and the minaret points us to the fact that this iwan is beside a mosque, and therefore it forms part of a madrasa. Now, let me talk for a moment about Kashan, the city in which this bowl was made. It sits more or less midway between Ray and Isfahan. It's at a very important nexus of trade routes, a north-south route which would take the caravans into the Persian Gulf, and also an east-west route. The cities of Ray and Kashan were capitals, whereas the cities of Ray and Isfahan were capitals, whereas Kashan was not. But it was nevertheless important for its trade links. The two cities of Ray and Isfahan are important because they were the capitals of the Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty which took political control in 1051. They came from this area here with their camels. They were camel breeders and herders, and they apparently came down because of an unexpectedly cold series of winters. They encountered the Samani dynasty, a Persian dynasty, who they overthrew, and they carried on westward until they made a kind of power sharing arrangement with the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. But they became political rulers of Iran, effectively. So Kashan was famed for its learning, its fine calligraphy, its ceramics, and its textile and carpet production. It became a very wealthy city, the home of many merchants. These are two merchants' houses from a later period, but also of bureaucrats, and a center of learning with several noted madrasas. It sits within an alluvial plain with good resources of clay and minerals, water and wood in the surrounding mountains, which made it an ideal place for fine ceramic production. And in the mid-12th century, it becomes a really extraordinary center of innovative ceramics with many different techniques of both of decoration and of production. Its fame becomes so great that the word for ceramics and tiles becomes the name of the city. So in both Persian and Arabic, the words Kashi or Kashani mean tile or ceramic. The manufacture of tiles and pottery was therefore so closely identified with the town that the product came to be named after it. At least 4 families of potters are known to have worked there for over several generations. As you can imagine, the trade was passed from from father to son. Abul Qasim Kashani was not a potter, he was a bureaucrat. He was actually working for an Ilkhanid ruler in Tabriz, but he writes a really significant treatise on minerals and gems and perfumes. And the final chapter is devoted to what he calls, to the technology and the ingredients and the methods of making ceramics. And within this final chapter, he described the enamel of two firings, which is his way of describing the method for making lustre, this way of applying a lovely metallic reflective surface onto the top of the ceramic. It's actually a very complicated method, and it requires you to first of all fire the object with a white glaze, then to make a very complicated mixture with some pretty poisonous substances, including arsenic, but mixed with notably copper and silver, which are what are going to give the reflective effect. And these are dissolved in grape juice and then painted onto the cold vessel. Now, the point about this is that this allows the artist to create very painterly decoration because he's painting the lustre on with a brush. The object is then fired in a reduction kiln in which there is a chemical reaction between the oxygen and the metal, and the metals are bonded onto the surface. And Abul Qasim very poetically describes this as reflecting like red gold and shining like the light of the sun. And on the left, I've put a dish, which is probably my most favorite piece of ceramic from the entire Islamic world. It's a wonderful, slightly, almost a cartoonish image of a figure in a private collection near Henley called the Sarakhani collection. And here you have this individual also sitting cross-legged, not dissimilar in some ways to the teacher in the class scene, with this wonderful little round eye. And you can see that every strand of his beard has been painted on. And this is the painterly quality that I was describing. Now, the event that brought the potters to Kashan, this technology of making lustre, is not one that you can invent. It has to be passed on. It has to be a transfer of technology. And it was happening in Egypt in the 11th and 12th century. But in the mid-12th century, the defeat of the Fatimid regime in Egypt by Saladin really meant that there was an exodus of potters who left Fustat, the industrial capital of Cairo, in order to find new and safer places to work. And they ended up in Kashan. Some of them ended up in Kashan, where they brought the technology and the style with them. And so I've put here two bowls. The one on the left was made in Fustat and the one on the right was made in Kashan. And then you can see that in both cases, what we've got is two mythical creatures, a sphinx on the left and a horse on the right, depicted against a background of lustre, which allows the artist to then put details onto the white ground to give you a more accurate depiction. And in the background, we've got these dynamic scrolling palmettes in both cases, which frame the animals and give extra movements to the motif on the dish. The artists who came didn't just come from the West. They didn't just come from Egypt. I think they came from all over. And I'm very struck by this fragment, which is from a very similarly large dish as the one that we started off looking at. And this is also in the Sarakhani collection. And I think you can see here that we've got two faces. Although it's fragmentary, there are two figures, a male and a female. This would be the man and this is the woman. You can tell from her headdress. And the features are very close in style to the type of painting that was found on much earlier frescoes, such as this detail from the Turfan Oasis, which suggests to me that artists were also coming from the East. A distinguishing feature of Kashan lusterwares is that so many of them carry the name of the potter that crafted and painted them. And this has allowed scholars, notably Oliver Watson, to identify a chronology of lustre styles between around 1170 and 1300. And I'm going to end on these two bowls, which were both made by a specific artist called Abu Zaid Kashani. He stands out because we know of so many of the pieces, of the tiles and the objects and the fragments that are signed by him that have survived. 32, I think, at the last count. And these have dates that span over 34 years. And he was not only working in lustre, this is a lustre bowl signed by him, he was also working in a polychrome technique, which applies other colors in both inglaze and overglaze, which give an even greater sense. It's even more like actually painting on paper. So this dish with its classroom scene has several layers of significance. Its quality and its size point to the skill of the artist, and its unique choice of a literary subject underscores the status of the artist working in Kashan. In a medium that did not always have inherent status, it was generally felt to come below metal and glass in the hierarchy of materials. So this is really points to a very special moment in the history of ceramics. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Natasha Morris.
Thank you, Chiara, Melanie, and Malcolm for your introduction. So I'm one of the co-conveners of the Islamic art module along with Chiara, and I'm also a specialist in Persian art. So I'm going to talk today about a decorative panel of tiles from the city of Isfahan, the seat of power under the Safavid dynasty, who ruled Iran from 1501 to 1736. We're going to examine this object in three ways. Firstly, its manner of production and its material qualities, and then looking at the implications of its iconography, and lastly, exploring the content of its display. So, a look firstly at the material components of the frieze. So each of these individual tiles is crafted from a technique known in European parlance as cera de seca, which is Spanish for dry cord. So this name is relative to the process of burning away a line of a greasy substance, such as manganese carbonate, that is placed between each area of colour. This basically prevents them from bleeding into one another during a third and final round of firing. So this cord-like line then dissolves, leaving behind a grey-black outline between each section of hue. This method of tile production was hugely popular during the Safavid period when the frieze was made, as well as under the preceding Timurid dynasty in the 15th century, and so it's often ubiquitous across most Persian ceramic and architectural decoration of the early modern period. The Persian term haftarang, or seven colours, has also been used interchangeably with cera de seca. So this more local wording was first used by Ilkhanid historians in the 14th century to describe tiles, or kashi, that were produced using the dry cord technique and which employ 7 key colours in their programme of design, most of which we can see here in the components of this picnic scene. So we've got shades of turquoise, blue, yellow, red, brown, black and white. We can also see that there are 2 different approaches here to the same technique in terms of the design elements used. So there's a central area of figuration and landscape elements with fine details such as facial features and hair executed in black. So there's this freer, kind of less geometric approach to the design here, which is evocative of the painterly manner of manuscript miniatures and single sheet works. Single page paintings, of which here we have an example, emerged as a major focus of artistic production that particularly flourished in 17th century Isfahan. So the poses, facial features and garments of the figures on the tile recall the style of Reza Abbasi, who was the chief painter of the Safavid atelier. There is another nod here to book-based painting in the border that runs around the outside of the frieze. So it has this blue ground with a repeating pattern in which cloud bands, which are mostly yellow and some white, alternate with vine scroll motifs in a black edged with white, all executed in coloured glaze. And this is analogous to the borders of manuscript pages, which usually adorn a centralized image or text. We have this illustrated here with 2 comparative examples. So these visual parallels are symptomatic of a broader intermediary approach of Persian and Islamic arts. And this is where we can see the transference of both motifs and patterns across different mediums. The central area of tilework presents us with a picture of Persianate courtly conviviality. And this is something which, at least on the surface, may seem at odds with its positioning within a gallery of Islamic art as it is at the V&A. This object also speaks to tropes of beauty, of merrymaking and of fecundity, which were uniquely interwoven with the social and religious atmosphere of the time. So, to further contextualize the imagery that we have here, the two central figures appear to be that of a courtly woman who's wearing a peaked diadem and has her feet dipped in henna, and her page, or saki, meaning wine bearer. And these two central figures are then flanked by both male and female servants, each of whom is dressed in conventional contemporary fashions. So we see them kind of dressed in a long robe, a turban, and a sash tied at the waist. And these contrasting patterns of fabric are richly detailed with definition, which is again provided by this dry cord technique. So in reclining and serving each other within this verdant outdoor setting, the panel depicts a springtime festivity, and this is most likely part of the celebrations surrounding Nowruz, or the Persian New Year, an event which heralds the rebirth of nature at winter's end and the beginning of spring. The gathering is also surrounded by examples of contemporary material culture, from the long-necked wine bottles and dainty drinking cups of gold and blue, to the lustreware bowls that are carefully stacked with pomegranates. And the designs of these quote either kind of valuable Chinese originals or Safavid copies of blue and white ceramics that would have filled the courtly china cabinet known as a chaikhana. So in this image, we are also situated in a kind of time of collecting as well as a space of conviviality. There are, of course, other borrowings from Chinese decorative styles, such as the scrolling cloud forms at the top of the panel, which really speak to an enduring fascination with the virtuosity of Chinese art on the part of the Persians, as well as this cosmopolitan environment of Safavid Isfahan, where influences from what has been traditionally known as the East and the West could converge in a mercantile and hospitable capital. The Safavids' own mode of rule was predicated on this sense of conviviality. In establishing Twelver Shi'ism as the empire's religion, and this was differing from the Sunnism of the neighboring Ottoman and Mughal empires, the Safavids established a manner of kingship that emulated the personal charisma of Imam Ali, a figure who they believed to be the divinely ordained successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Part of this royal prerogative entailed mixing piety with pleasure, and its combining of pre-existing Persian attitudes to kingship with the compelling persona of the Imam. So the Safavids worked to create an open court where the Shah could mingle readily with his subjects, whilst diplomacy was enacted through feasts. And the Shah here would act as a charming host to gift-laden envoys and curious travellers. As such, this scene is also emblematic of an atmosphere fostered by that Safavid mode of governance, something which is also exemplified by the frescoes on the walls of the Chehel Satun Palace in Isfahan. Now, the positioning of an object within a gallery can either enhance or obscure our interpretation. So this particular frieze is placed on the back wall of the Jamil Gallery of the Islamic Middle East in the V&A. Its eye-catching location capitalizes on the panel's original positioning under a window or in a niche, which would have covered the lower parts of a wall. This was most likely a palace pavilion, given the courtly nature of its decorative program. So as a result of this positioning, we experience the frieze, at least in physical terms, in a similar way to its original purpose. So in walking up to the tile, we are made immediately aware of its architectural situation, its links to interior design, and the part that it would then play in creating an atmosphere akin to the one that it depicts. And this is quite a sizable panel, so it measures just over 1 meter high and 2 across. So it acts almost as if it were a window to an imagined gathering taking place beyond the palace, whilst also locating the potential of such festivities within. It's interesting to consider then how we interact with architectural elements within a gallery setting. Which height are they positioned? And if they were part of a larger piece or a standalone work? We can also consider what company objects keep around them within the room itself. So noticing our own visual and bodily relationship to these objects. This frieze, for example, is also more broadly contextualized within the gallery in being placed next to textiles, which also share quotations of this painterly iconographic style. So here we have a textile flanking the tilework frieze with single figures, fashionable yews and cypress trees, which again are drawn together in kind of a poetic comparison. And these also appear on swathes of fabric and garments contemporary to the tilework. Further to this, we see that the neighbouring cabinets house examples of Safavid blue and white pottery, similar to those which we see lying amongst the grass at the feet of the partygoers. So in being placed together, we are afforded a glimpse of the sumptuous life that was enjoyed at the Persian court and by the Safavid elites. And this display epitomizes not only the aesthetics, but also the pleasures and sensibilities of 17th century Isfahan. So to conclude, this Safavid frieze and ones like it, such as the panel that is housed in the Met in New York, have been the subject of much scholarly inquiry, as well as having been mentioned in primary sources by European visitors to the Persian court. Such interpretations and descriptions can help to paint a fuller picture of the form, function, and reception of such objects, both in their original iteration and also considering their place within the broader study of Persian and Islamic art. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you to all three of our speakers who've given us such a diverse and distinctive way, of a range of ways, indeed, of approaching the broader question of what constitutes Islamic art, how to engage with it, how to understand it, how to appreciate it, and how to contextualize it. This is just a small taste of the kinds of teaching that you will have if you join us on our Islamic art module and the postgraduate diploma in Asian art here at SOAS. And as I said in my introduction, I would be delighted to meet with you one-to-one and tell you more about what our program will offer for you and to make sure that we're the right fit for your academic needs or your interests. So please do get in touch with me, nm133@soas.ac.uk, if you'd like to take this conversation further and find out if this module is the right fit for you. We look forward to hearing from you. And thank you once again to our three speakers for these fantastic presentations that immersed us in the many worlds that the Islamic arts sector or sphere has to offer for us. Thank you once again.